We're sort of looking alright. Bit of a motley crew.
Well, one of us is looking all right. I don't know about you. We're back in the Gunners Club.
We're back in the Gunners Club, and we're glad you're with us here, of course, with Gunner and with Seuss. How are you, Seuss?
I'm getting older by the day, but better looking.
Well, I was lucky enough the other day to go and see Hugh Cornwell from the Stranglers play. He came to St Kilda, and he wrote some great songs, like Golden Brown and another famous one. And he had a bit of a look-see around St Kilda, around the beach, just before playing the concert. And he's speaking to a lady and asking how she was going. She said, it's okay, but there's always a sun. And he said, that'd make a great title for a song. And of course, in the concert he played, There's Always a Sun.
Oh, okay.
I was very, very pleased. Today we're talking about the West, the decadent West. And look, here's my 2 cents. We're going to talk a lot about the history of the West, what the West is, and why I've come to this conclusion. But I'm going to put my cards out on the table. The West has fallen. When I see the Olympics and I see a man fighting a woman in boxing for our betterment, for our edification, the West has fallen. When I see a people who do not know what values that they stand for, the West has fallen.
Well, if it hasn't fallen, it's well on the way.
That's right. So once a trend's in place, we really know where we're going. Now, the concept of the West is really interesting. You could say that it's taken the world 4,000 years to create who the West is. There's actually a book that's recently come out that says exactly this. And we try to say, well, who is the West? Is it an idea? Is it a geography? Is it a people? Well, yes and no, it's not really any of those things.
Well, I would have thought it was an idea, really.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to start. Although, if you go back historically, you could see that people tried drastically, after Egypt was in fashion, to come up with the start of the idea of civilization in Europe. And effectively, after Egypt, the next step north was Crete. It was only a little bit further north. The most southerly island, really, of Greece, and the Palace of Knossos, where you had the first crown room, throne room in Europe. So this obsession of drawing Western ideas as to who we are to ancient Greece is one that just won't go away. They said, well, here was the first throne room. And that sort of continued on to the creation of the EU, where by hook or by crook they wanted to shoehorn Greece into the EU, get them into the economic union and also on the currency and claim the history of that. But before Greece there was ancient Rome, but a lot of things from ancient Rome they really took from the Near East around them.
Of course.
So things like legislation from Mesopotamia, irrigation from Assyria or Iraq today, the alphabet from the Levant region. But we say, well, maybe we can trace ourselves back to Greece and to Rome. And we can say that because, well...
Only because of the democracy and how we perceive it, because we sort of like believe that that's where democracy originated. So that's what we're basing it on, I'm imagining.
Yeah, I think you're pretty much right in saying that. But we could say that a lot of these ideals that the Romans and the Greeks had would be very foreign to the idea of being a Westerner today. For example, the idea of, only men being able to vote and men basically seducing young boys. That was a very Greek idea.
There's a good joke about that.
Women only been able to go out wearing veils. We would think of that as being outside of Western tradition today, but that was life in ancient Greece. The holding of slaves and execution for amusement, that was a Roman idea.
Yep.
So these things, we're saying we're going back to the bastion of the early Western civilization. Really, to a large extent, I think we're geographically struggling with where the West is and to draw some sort of barriers as to where that was, and falling back on your idea, like you've just said, of what democracy is and where democracy came from. I mean, we've got a representative democracy today. It's not really a true democracy.
No, well, that's right.
And America and Australia, really, you've only got the two-party system, really. It's a choice between fiddle-dee and fiddle-don't.
I was going to say something that, if you're talking about Biden, he certainly does.
Okay, so there's been a lot of things which have happened in Europe which I think have really put us to the situation we're in today. If you have a look at how an organisation works, for example, a big company, they basically go through these phases of how they grow how they atrophy, how they die, and then how new ones are controlled. Societies are pretty much like that as well. Now, we think that everything here today is new because countries like Australia, where we're at, and America are reasonably new. America probably 400 years, you give it. Australia about 200 years of European occupation. But that's not where it starts and finishes, although it might be close to where it finishes. We really can go back to the English culture and English history, where we've got our law, where we've got ideas and our traditions and our family values, etc. from. And all the way through, really, what we've done is we've embraced a lot of the typical, what we call Western thoughts through Christianity as well. Now, there's been a lot of things which have destroyed that. I'd say in 1530, when King Henry wanted to have a male child, and he wasn't given a divorce through the Catholic Church, he basically abolished the papal authority of England. 1530. That was a very big change. There's been other changes as well, I think, that have weakened the church. So the insistence of the separation of church and state. And when we went through the period of enlightenment in England, it really was going to an idea of reason, scientific discovery, and also very heavily on that as well was the separation of church and state. Oliver Cromwell, who I know that you've studied up with as well, who I think was the third signature to petition for regicide, the killing of a king, of King Charles I.
Rightly so, in that particular case, I would have thought.
Let's remember that Western society has always struggled with the idea of where we get the origin of power from. And if you look at Australia, even more so, because Australians say, well, who's effectively given this authority through to the Crown in Australia? This was never Crown land. This was land which was invaded. It's a separate argument, but it's a legal argument in any case. But if in fact you dare to kill the king, regicide, you are simply denying what was thought of to be a God-given right to have power over people. So this is where
which is totally opposite and goes against any idea of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, and there's an argument there as well, because you could say the king's not being voted for, so it's certainly not democratic.
Well, no, a king by his very nature is a birthright and passed down from family member to family member.
Sure.
So so the people have no say in reality in that case.
It's very interesting that with education today, that they don't seem to focus upon the classic form of education, so the triumvirate of education. So what they'd say is the most important thing is everything starts on grammar, and by grammar I mean the rules or the facts of things, learning the facts of your society, learning what there is to be proud of. Now, growing up under common law in Australia, and basically inheriting a lot of the richness of the British culture, and it is very, very, very rich, and really we should be able to hold our heads up high, because Western society, which we're continuing to define, has really struggled for millennia to develop to where we are today. Learn the facts. Once you've learned the facts, learn how to analyse them. So what they call logic, or logos, reasoning. And then from there, that very public Roman art that they used to have, which was rhetoric. Once you're empowered by the facts and you've learned how to reason, then learn how to build a cogent argument and persuade other people. Now, it seems to me today that a lot of the protests that I see on the street, a lot of this dumping on the values and mores that people have inherited, they seem to skip the first stage, which is the grammar of the rules.
They make up their own words and redefine them.
Yeah, and it's actually mostly young girls who redefine the English language, so that's a different sort of argument in itself, but they do. Because look, so if they're not going back to learn the facts, how did the society ground? Why are we in the position we're in today?
Yep.
Then how can you analyse the facts? If you can't analyse the facts, what is the point of convincing someone of your point of view? It does stand to reason. And former British Prime Minister May, and she was only in power, really, I think she came into power 2 days after the death of Queen Elizabeth II.
That's right.
And she was really only in power for a couple of months. She's recently written a book, and she argues that it is the fault of the right in that they have not stood up to the demands made by the left, and further, they have not organised themselves or shared what there is to be proud of. So the facts haven't been focused upon, and there's been no analysis put forward, and there's been no cogent argument disseminated in school. And further, people in schools are not taught these things. So, for example, in Australia, we have a set of exams which the students do. I think it's around the year 10 year level. Yep. And it's the same as the other countries in the OECD, so that the developed West basically would say economically, if not in thought. I mean, Singapore's part of it. You could say that in thought, they're not Western. They're not Western because, the Enlightenment we've spoken about focuses on the rights of the individual. They focus more on the rights of the society.
Yes.
And there's a cogent argument that can be made either side for that. 1/4 of Australian students perform so badly that by definition, they cannot function effectively in today's society. Now, that's what I would say is an argument for a decadent West. Now, remember, decadence...
Or poor delivery of education.
Well, again, going back to the 3 important things of what education is: facts, reasoning, and then being able to deliver the argument. So that really goes back to the idea of a decadent society. Remember, decadence means something which is regressing. It's regressing in values, it's regressing in identity, it's regressing basically on every measure that you can do. That's really of concern to me.
And Theresa May had a very valid point, that the right haven't pushed their logic and their point of view, and that gives rise to the left-leaning to be able to raise their voices, and the louder that you scream, the more you're heard.
That's really right. Let's go back to a classical perspective. So Plato in the Republic basically argued that when people's rights are raised to a level of equality, that effectively they will start to see themselves as being above the state. Now, it's also argued that really the best way that you can have a strong, cohesive society is a people in peril. A people under threat, a people in war. They're a very cohesive people.
Well, they have to be.
They have to be to survive.
Yeah.
And basically during that period, they have a concept of xenophobia. So, xenos in Greece is strangers, phobos is a fear, or really it's a hate in today's English, what we'd say, instead of that fear. They see the outside world as being their enemies. Now, don't forget, I'm arguing in part that the West is a creation of the world. Remember, we talked about the earlier technologies and the earlier thoughts which came through. They weren't in a domain geographically or invented necessarily in the West either. But it seems that Plato was right. But not only that, I would argue from about the period of the 60s when the Rolling Stones were singing songs like "Let's Spend the Night Together Now, I Need You More Than Ever," that this idea of kicking back at the mores that you learnt from the previous generations became fashionable. Now, actually, this is not something which is unexpected. Remember I spoke about the way that companies and societies start to transform and they go through the modes of change? This is really a change from what you call a xenophobia to ecophobia. Now, you've heard the word eco before, economics, right? Eco's it's an ancient Greek word for the house. It's basically beginning to hate the house or the people that you live amongst.
Okay.
And this is something which is very popular amongst adolescents when they discover the ideas of punk rock, dressing up radically, let's say, as well, staying up late at nights and kicking back against parents. It's very healthy. It's very healthy because otherwise, the saddest thing I've ever seen was a young Joey kangaroo that was old enough to be outside of its mother's pouch that kept wanting to get back into the mother's pouch.
All right.
Right? So naturally there's got to be an aggression, there's got to be a hostility against the preconceived notions. You've got to test the water out for yourself. Adolescents generally get past this stage at about 16, 17. Academics don't. So with academics, what seems to happen is they get atrophied on this idea because it's seen as something radical. It's seen as something which is worth discovering, and a PhD's got to be written on something new. Also going back to what Plato said as well, that they've achieved that level of equality and they start to actually have an open contempt for the society which has brought them to where they are. This is not clever. Essentially what this means is that it's biting the hand that feeds us. Essentially it means is that there's a loss of identity of the society which has actually brought the opportunity for these people. I really think it's this idea which is bringing us to men hitting women in the boxing ring in the Olympics.
If it was anywhere other than that, you'd be in jail. That's the thing. That's the reality of it. And yet it seems to be sanctioned by a world sporting organisation as being okay.
Yeah, but certainly not the IBA, and that's really the reason why the IBA, that International Boxing Authority, was not allowed to referee during the Olympics, because they have very clear thoughts on what's what.
Yeah, but and then they bring them out, as in there's a woman and a transgender woman, and the referee warns both of them not to hit each other in the testicles.
Now look, there's other things as well, really, which I think we have to touch upon with cultural decadence. Please don't believe that what's being said in our media, that's what's being said in our parliament, stays behind these closed doors. Everything that happens in parliament is published, it's publicly available in Hansard. And if you think that our political enemies outside of Australia and outside of the West are not listening with relish to the internal division and weakness that's going on, really, your eyes are just not open.
We are heading down the wrong road.
Thanks for joining us again on Sociology. We've got plenty of adventures we'd like you to join us with. If you like what we do,
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
and go back to our back catalogue. We've got a lot of adventures there. There'll be one that you like.
And don't forget to give us some comments because, hey, we have been known to be wrong. Not often, mind you, but we have been known to be wrong.
Not below the belt.